Daniel, thank you so much. I'm really honored to be talking to you all. Thank you. Thank you for joining in various ways. Honored to be in any series that has Anthony Reed in it as well. I'm going to try to share my screen and see how this works. Um, Great. So on the very final stop of his tour of the monuments of Passaic, New Jersey, a photo essay published in Art Forum in 1967. Robert Smithson imagines a public playground sandbox as a model desert. And he then zooms in so that the granular silica seemed to expand and spread out to encompass this entire post apocalyptic planet. Quote, the monument of minute particles blazed under a bleakly glowing sun and suggested the sullen dissolution of entire continents, the drying up of oceans. No longer were there green forests and high mountains. All that existed were millions of grains of sand, a vast deposit of bones and stones pulverized into dust. So it's obviously there's a lot going on in this lurid prose, but that change of scale that zooms into the sandbox in order to imagine it as a desert landscape is a really signature move for Smithson in his Spiral Jetty essay. He proclaims that size determines an object, but scale determines art. Scale, he reiterates later in the essay, is one of the key issues in terms of art. And Smithson, there's echoing Barnett Newman, who asserted that in art, it's scale that counts. Smithson soon echoed in turn by Michael Heiser, who explained that while size is an actual measurement, scale could be said to be an aesthetic measurement. And the discourse around primary structures in the mid 60s foregrounds this tension between scale and size as the differentiating factor between sculpture and monument in what would come to be called minimalism. And I'm thinking of statements like Tony Smith's answers to questions about his 6-foot steel cube titled Die. There it is in the MoMA Sculpture Garden. Why didn't you make it larger? I wasn't making a monument. Why didn't you make it smaller? I wasn't making an object. Or Robert Morris in his notes on sculpture, it's published just a year before Smithson's tour, has the constant of a human body calibrating the sense of scale for sculpture along a continuum of sizes, where it falls between monument on the one end and ornament on the other. Here you can see Smithson measuring the size of his cryospheres. This is at the primary structures exhibition at the Jewish Museum before stepping back maybe to check out the scale of the cryospheres. So by narrativizing this expansive transformation of scale in a tour of these diminutive and deprecated monuments, Smithson's allegorizing these current debates. I want to argue in short that given the shift of scale in that sandbox scene, his essay would have been about monuments, even without that sardonic word in the title. And Smithson indeed is interested not merely in scale, but in its transformations. And he's particularly fascinated by scalability. He fantasizes that a crack in a wall, if viewed in terms of scale, not size, could be called the Grand Canyon. A room could be made to take on the immensity of the solar system. It's this typical moment in his writing. Elsewhere, he marvels that a point on a map expands to the size of a landmass contracts to a point. And so, prefiguring the, I think, the Powers of 10 film by Ray and Charles Eames, with its exponential scaling of orders of magnitude, the rhetoric and the original sequencing of photographs in Smithson's Spiral Jetty essay invite comparisons between his jetty construction and then similar forms, all the way up to the level of a galaxy all the way down to the microscopic helices of molecular structures of salt crystals in the briny waters of Great Salt Lake. And so part of what I wanted to do in my book, Helicography, is take up Smithson's invitation and try to wrap my head around a series of virtual jetties, spirals expanded or contracted to the precise size of that 1,500-foot curved extension from those galaxies down to similar rotational fluid forms, hurricanes, whirlpools, Fibonacci material, packing structures in snail shells and sunflowers and fern fronds, turns of the inner ear. These are all spirals that come about because of the most efficient geometric arrangement for cell growth in constricted spaces, coiling of a snake, antique watch springs, phonograph grooves, and perhaps most of all, the concentric excavated steps of the largest open pit mine in the world. It is just across the valley from me here, the Bingham Canyon Kennecott Company, Rio Tinto Corporation copper mine. There it is, as Smithson would have seen it. And I'll read I'm going to read an excerpt from a section of Helicography that calculates the volume of King Ubu's belly button if the gidoïle, the signature spiral he sports on his torso there, were scaled to the size of spiral jetty. Accordingly, his umbilicus would hold a volume just equal to the lower limit defining a large spill of crude oil, or the oil that gurgled to the surface one day in June along an Allegheny tributary berthing the Seneca Oil Company, which would have displaced the amount of regular unleaded gasoline overflowing the top of a tank in Rogers, Arkansas, at the Morgan Stanley well 141 years later, which was double the engine displacement of the tainted vehicles Volkswagen conceded it would buy back after its fraudulent emission scandal, or the per household vehicle fuel consumption of gasoline in the United States in the late 80s, the same amount furnished to the Senate garage by the Texas company in just 1 month, July 1932, at 7.39 cents per gallon, still just a hair under $1.33 generally at today's rate, although actually a negative $107.92 in late April 2020. The output of a single Tehran refinery during the War of Cities equal to the kerosene issued to the U.S. military as it fought at Wounded Knee, or the fuel oil discharge to shore docks at Dungarvan in 1923, or the seal oil procured one summer at Quan Rock, west of Cape Argujas, as the surf thundered above the cry of gulls, the whale oil wrung by crofter fishermen with makeshift means on Orkney and sold at Newcastle, as George Lowe made a surveying tour of the island, or the coconut oil floated by ship from Nicobar to Calcutta, along with 16,627 seamen, and the amount of pure olive oil, really cottonseed oil, exported from New York to England for Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. The linseed oil from New Orleans as streetcar service expanded past Napoleon Avenue and from Philadelphia to Monsieur McCulloch and Alexander in Edinburgh a century earlier. The winter oil wrangled by the city of Philadelphia from Deal and Duff as the Christiana riot trials began at $1.20 per gallon, less 1 cent per gallon for casks returned. The benzene accounted for in the costs of the Picton government it has established the first residential institution for child migrants. The specific amount of turpentine gum hawked as Apollo 13 launched toward the moon, the cartons of copper preservative conceded to tilapia fisheries in British Guiana as the Church of England lends its moral backing to family planning, the bright varnish schemed by the U.S. Navy in Singapore as catfish fell from the skies, the number 61 dryer measure dispensed in Pratt and Lambert paints from their plant in Long Island City as the 5 boroughs of Greater New York consolidated. The increase in the amount of fluid extracts and tinctures manufactured by the New York Department of Hospitals as Bernice Abbott swept back into town, or the creosote expended per saturation load of telegraph pole preparation by S.P. Bolton's patent process good for a full 47 poles, enough to cover a mile of open western ground. At the center of his jutting, paunchy dome, bloated taut with feasting on biscuits soggy with jelly and corned beef hash topped with eggs, Ubu's jetty belly button could hold, instead of petrochemicals, a lash of hops, the dry product unit measure used in Baltic ports from the 14th to 19th centuries, the mash in store at Mr. Cornelius Quigg's still in Philadelphia when inspected for fraud as the Albany Bachelor Baseball Club travels to confront the Excelsior and Pythians at the parade grounds. The vat of strong ale brewed for the Marquis of Abercorn, Dublin, along with some light ale of very indifferent quality, though perhaps too strong meted to assop servants in order to defend a palace coup. As a semaphore line is stretched across the Irish Sea, the amount of strong beer dispersed from the populace of Salisbury as Constable paints the cathedral from Bishop Fisher's garden as ordered by the mayor, the carriage of strong beer imported as the first of the Spring Hill mining disasters struck into Cannington, Wapella, and Moosomin, barrels seized and stayed for unlicensed brewing in West Clive as the 4th Street funicular's White Line opens into Buick. The beer kept in the cellar according to the probate inventories of the Wellington Mercers. An amount taken to the cellar as Rinaldo and Almarena celebrate their love among the rebuke of the poisoning arts of adultery and sophistications and corrupt mixtures, the yield of hard cider from an acre of red strakes and golden pippins, the light wine meant to sustain a crew of 39 men over a 5-month period, while whaling off Honfleur, during which Blaise Pascal's Lettres Provinciales are shredded, and burnt the wine drunk daily among the furs and pleasures and sparkling jewels, the most memorable and honorable incident of Kenilworth Castle during the royal entertainment by the Earl to his Queen. The equal amounts of Verzenay, Cramont, and Avis, respectively, in the coupage of Cuvée in the fine years of 1857 and 1858, or of Bouzy, Pierry, Cramont, and Avis, respectively, in another the wine ruined by inferior grapes injured by rain at Verzenay, the bottles purveyed by Theobald Le Bottier at Dublin as John Rogers Thomas composes The Rose of Killarney, Tintos and Brancos imported by Strobel and Church to Liverpool from Portugal despite the siege of Almeida, the Bordeaux brought to London by the merchant adventurers mixed up with the pilgrims as the Mayflower prepares to sail, the magnums stowed by George Dubois for his voyage aboard the Titanic, the tankards brought to Portsmouth from Oporto on the Betty, as John assumes the most faithful majesty, the rum transferred from the sloop Betsy to the sloop Liberty by Dr. Fouchy, run on the Lydia from the West Indies to Nova Scotia, imported with promissory note, written in a fine Spenserian hand by the subscriber, Christopher Leffingwell, to the colony of Connecticut from Grenada on the brig Britannia, or sold by J. Cameron to G. Knight at 26 days credit in March of 1850, a weight for which the stevedores at Demerara charged 8 cents in the summer, a half-century later. For that fee, they could have carried the spirits stored in the old commissary department in Bethlehem after the resignation of Quartermaster Mifflin, the volume of intoxicating liquors seized by the marshal in Lewiston, Maine, some 16 years prior, which matched the volume of Hesperidina ushered into Bilbao from Argentina, where the first recorded tango, Angel Follard's El Choclo, was all the rage, or the volume of malt spirits distilled in Scotland the year a meteorite fell on the North Inch at Perth, or the full stores of spirits equipped, obtained in a pinch by feat of force by the expeditionary detachment of the Russian army in its advance to Khiva, which was the same as all the substandard alcohol exposed by sanitary inspectors in Russia during the Russo-Georgian War, or the export of ethyl alcohol from potatoes by Danish factory to Danske Spiritfabrikker, as suicides in Denmark are studied according to social status and sex. That same magnitude of apple brandy, undissipated, led to a disputed case in the Federal Appeals Court. An equal dram of rum in quart kegs was at issue in the cause of action litigated between Orme and Kegvin and James Henry Perry. The sugar at issue in the suit drummed dramatically between Rode and Thwaites, Allen and Hodge, and Lodge between Lambeth and Joffrion, averaged the production of the most important plantation estate in Jamaica as it abolishes slavery, or of the low and swampy levee on the Florida Peninsula equaling cargo taken on by the USS Rattler at Chamberlain's Plantation in Louisiana and delivered to the prize steamer Elmira, or the freight and haul for which was rendered many hearty thanks by William Barclay. That bulk equaled the crates of darkly black and adulterated old tobacco packed to Dundee from the Clyde, seized as honesta spolia by General Blackney from the customs house at Alloa, Clackmanshire, during the rebellion of 1745, were bound with the same stemmed press of dried and candied leaves as browned and tacky pages, their leather edges curling from the curing in volumes of a circulating nightshade library of inscribed alkaloids disseminating a parasympathomimetic stimulation of nicotine muscarine, but printed at an unredeemable cost of captive blood for Bristol a century earlier, discounted by the creditor Major Theophilus Hone as allowing for being of the most part rotten on arrival, or just a decade earlier discovered in a probate home, aged and unaccounted for in a cellar lodged without clearance, a cargo which John Fuller received 2 years later in acrimonious negotiation with his son, Rose, held inaccessibly close in the hull as the successive heir cleared out for Norway, shipped by Robert Wormley Carter of Sabine Hall to England. Same sad, mean stuff, shipped to Holland on the Brilliant, and again imported by Hamilton and Company from America, then to Malta via Rotterdam to France for commercial purposes via Leghorn, then picked up at the mouth of the Elkhorn by the Falls City steamer round about 1907 with the bill of lading hidden under the lantern, which would have brought an average of $7.20 on the market, which was the weekly tobacco sales at Louisville 40 years earlier, the very amount disputed in the lawsuit that arose from an internal revenue seizure contested in the complaint about freight rates from Paris to New Orleans on the Chattanooga line by Duthat and Crossway a half dozen years on, and a decade later, the full load in a 36-foot car, given the standardization of casks sought by the railroad interests, equivalent to 19,300,800 cigarettes, enough to keep the average Andorran smoking for 1,610 years, the average Czech away from the Traffica for 4,242 years, the average Parisian smoker for 9,450 years, the contented average placid island inhabitant of the abode of peace for over 1,000,000 years, or one cigarette for everyone in Jakarta or Lima or Nagoya or Bangkok, or almost every denizen of Wuhan, or a pack for every resident of Sacramento, California. And so on. It goes on like that to catalog instances of that same volume. This is 16 9/10 hogshead, to be precise, when packed with molasses. There's a subtext of transatlantic trade and extractive labor that runs through this section of the book. But I want to stay with Ubu for now as a way to come back to the topic of the virtual. Ubu, of course, best known character from French avant-gardist Alfred Jarry. And we know that while he was planning Spiral Jetty, Smithson was reading Jarry in the special issue of the Evergreen Review, subtitled "What is Pataphysics?" It's a question Jarry himself succinctly answers in his novel, neo-scientific novel, the exploits, the adventures and opinions of Dr. Faustruel, a pataphysician, who announces that pataphysics will be, above all, the science of the particular. It will investigate the laws that govern exceptions, and it will explain the universe supplementary to this one, or less ambitiously, it will describe a universe that one can envision and that perhaps one must envision in place of the traditional one. And so where conventional science is interested in the typical state, in averages, pataphysics is focused on the outlier or the aberrant or the quirk or the freak. An accurate physics calculation involving the temperature in the room would want to take the temperature at different points and average them. Pataphysics, is going to take this one particular atom here that's unusually slow or fast, and then proceed with those calculations, imagining that errant value is going to hold throughout. And I take that deadpan, faux naif follow through, proceeding as if to be the essence of the pataphysical imagination, to continue from some absurd proposition, but with all the seriousness and thoroughness and exhaustive meticulousness that the most serious science would have demanded. Jarry also follows that manifesto-like proclamation with a dictionary mode definition. Pataphysics is the science of imaginary solutions. I think there's a really perfect example of the imaginary solution in Steve Zoltansky's 2012 book, Agony, which is a book that gave me, I'd already started on the Jetty project, but it gave me really the permission and the provocation to really go all the way with these kind of equivalences in helicography. And I just want to read a a passage from Steve's book to give you a sense in case you don't know it. This is the opening of a chapter that's titled Feet, F-E-E-T, and you'll see the sort of figurative and literal potentials of bodily metrics being all to the point here. Let me see. Given that the average female breast protrudes about 2 inches from the chest, we can assume that the world's tallest building, the Burj Khalifa, is 16,104 breasts tall. Taipei 101 is 10,026 breasts tall. The Shanghai World Financial Center is 9,684 breasts tall. The International Commerce Center is 9,528 breasts tall. The Petronas Towers are each 8,898 breasts tall. If the Petronas Towers were stacked, one on top of another, they would be 17,796 breasts tall. So, let me see now. We now know the exact height of the 5 tallest buildings in the world measured in breasts, and additionally the exact height of the tallest twin buildings in the world if they were stacked measured in breasts. The average single family 2-story house in the US is 144 breasts tall. The average US man is 34.95 breasts tall. The average US woman is 32.15 breasts tall. Given that the average height of 1 story of a house is 48 breasts, we can assume that when the average US man stands in the average US room, there are 13.05 breasts between him and the second story if there is one, and that when the average US woman stands in an average US room, there are 15.85 breasts between her and the second story if there is one. So, when the average Taiwanese woman stands in the average US room, there's 16.45 breasts between her and the second story. Remember, the second tallest building in the world, as measured in breasts, is in Taiwan. Remember, the second tallest building in Taiwan is the Tuntek Sky Tower, 6,840 breasts. A few years ago, someone scaled the exterior of Taipei 101 at a rate of 2,506 breasts per hour. The average speed limit on a US highway is 3,801,600 breasts per hour. Given that most people drive over the speed limit by, say, 316,800 breaths per hour or so, we can assume that the actual average speed on a US highway is somewhere around 4,118,400 breaths per hour, while the average speed of a bullet fired from an M16 is 19,192.913415 breaths per second. And the average human hair grows at a rate of 7.486 times 10 to the 8 breaths per second. We now know exactly how much faster a bullet is than a hair. 2.56 times 10 to the 11 times faster. See? Let's see. If one were to fire an M16 from the top of the Empire State Building, which is 7,500 breaths tall, the bullet would hit the pavement or a pedestrian in 0.391 seconds. An M16 fires 13.333 bullets per second. If one fired an M16 continuously into a crowd for a whole minute, one could potentially hit 800 people, each with a different bullet. However, that outcome is highly unlikely. One could certainly hit 800 distinct points in space, and some or even many of those distinct points would potentially correspond to the space inhabited by human bodies. So, given that the average human breasts have a volume of 25 cubic breaths, and that the average human body has a volume of about 2,532.485 cubic breaths, we can assume that on average, breasts make up 0.987% of the human body. Given that the average human skin covers a surface area of 102 square breasts, and that the average skin covering the breast covers a surface area of 6.28 square breasts, we can assume that on average, breasts make up 6.157% of skin's surface area. But only 51% of humans have female breasts, which are the only breasts that concern us for now because they are proper to a majority percentage of humans. So we can assume that among 800 people, there would be 10,200 cubic breasts of breasts and 2,025,988 cubic breasts of entire human bodies. And we can assume that among 800 people, there would be 2,562.24 cubic breasts of breast and 81,600 cubic breasts of skin. Considering the surface area of the human body, if each bullet fired from an M16 hits one person, highly unlikely possibility, each bullet would have a 3.14% chance of striking a breast. QED. It's an imaginary solution to questions no one would ever have thought to ask. It's perfectly pataphysical. And it goes on for another 100 pages like that. Jarry's definition continues. Pataphysics, the science of imaginary solutions, which symbolically attributes to their lineaments the properties of objects described by their virtuality, which brings us to the topic of the lecture series, the virtual. And we can see this logic of, a contrast between the exception and the general, between the abstract and the particular here. The lineament, that general elementary sketch or schema, takes on the specific properties of a possible, potential, speculative, fanciful, improbable material state. Right? It symbolically attributes to their lineaments the properties of objects described by their virtuality. And I think the virtual here, something like the simulacral that Jean Baudrillard develops with a direct, open debt to Jarry, something that is not in fact real, but goes on to have, or is taken to have, real world consequences. Jarry's use of virtuality, I think, further aligns with that as if at the heart of pataphysics. If we think of the virtual in the sense of, quote, designating a notional property, dimension, etc. of a thing which would produce an observed effect if counteracting factors, such as friction, are not allowed for. It's an OED definition. And in this virtual transference, as Linda Stillman puts it, the imaginary hypothesis replaces the known or the probable and insinuates itself into the order of things as reality. There's that as if. Jarry's constantly shifting perspectives establish the possible rather than the probable as credible. And even the denotation of the virtual in the sense from optical physics corroborates Jarry's perspectival logic, or illogical perspective, an image for which the light forming it appears to diverge from a point beyond the refracting or reflecting surface. Stephen Ramsey sums it up in his book on algorithmic criticism, quote, "Pataphysics is the apotheosis of perspectivalism, which refuses to see scale as a barrier to knowledge." So rather than keep the aesthetic and the scientific apart, clearly separating scale and size, Jarry maps the imaginative, speculative, fanciful leaps required by the relativity of perspective and scalability onto the epistemological world of measurement and scientific equipment. And like Smithson, with his giddy perspectival shifts, Jarry swings from the imaginative possibilities of the literal to the literal possibilities of the imaginative, as Ramsey nicely puts it. So, for instance, Jarry proposes, quote, "Instead of formulating the law of the fall of a body toward the center, how far more apposite would be the law of the ascension of a vacuum toward the periphery." So Jarry, in short, and he was less than 5 feet tall, Jarry, resonant for helicography, simultaneously offering me this art historical argument about the iconography of Smithson's structure, a thematic, phallic centerpiece to the narrative through his Ubu character, and most of all, a methodological point of reference for my project. In passages like the one I just read, I'm connecting all the instances of some particular measure, 4,840.22 liters, say, across the entire library of Google Books. These crazy lists of equivalences in helicography are a narrativation of the limits of the virtual library. And it's no surprise, right, that Google's dream of a digital Alexandrian library doesn't live up to the reality of its actual impoverished textual store, right? The ideal abstraction of some total comprehension is always going to run up against the limits of the material and the real. So the discrepancy between ambition and realization is to be expected, but the particular distortions and deformations that mark the lineaments of the Google Books catalog, I think, are interesting. And those passages in helicography make some of those virtual contours palpable. I'm thinking of the grotesqueries of copyright claims, or state and federal documents, court documents, which by definition don't fall under copyright, are copious on Google, for instance, and they provide much of that material. The blindness of optical character recognition as it gazes at certain typefaces and certain typographic layouts, the projection, in fact, of university library architecture, to name just a few, as well as the visibility of time congealed labor in the same way that Google Books tries to scrub the occasional images of its workers' hands from online scans of book pages. And these are workers with different clearance to a sequestered part of the Mountain View campus, different network access permission, different pay, different scheduling, and who are mostly women of color, all in contradistinction to the engineers and the coders in other parts of the Google Office complex. In the same way that Google tries to scrub these images, there's a way that Google's conception of digital text itself and its indexicable ordering works to erase not just the mise en page of typographic specificity, but the labor that went into those book pages in the first place. It's a collective of activist librarians who write around a project they called the Mondotech. Quote, the computer scientist's view of textual content as unstructured, be it in a web page or the OCR scanned pages of a book, reflect a negligence to the processes and labor of writing, editing, design, layout, typesetting, and eventually publishing, collecting, and cataloging. Whether speaking of bales of cotton, barrels of oil, or bags of words, what links these subjects is the way in which the notion of raw material obscures the labor and power structures employed to secure them. So all of these deformations, copyright, typography, architecture, scanning conditions, things that I learned with my previous scholarly book, Dictionary Poetics. It's a book about the use that writers have made of particular editions of specific dictionaries, for which Google Books might have saved literally months and months of sleuthing if it had included a wide range of dictionaries in its virtual library. But a combination of zealous copyright vigilance, publishers like Merriam-Webster, the intentional exception of dictionaries from snippet view, ideological assumptions about the status of reference books, and their architectural separation from the main stacks in a library, right? Google sets out to scan the important books in a university library, not just all the texts in the building, as well as OCR limitations on volumes that are so large that they curve dramatically from gutters with narrow margins. They're hard to hold open even on a large bed scanner. Those pages have often tabs cut out from the foredge, thin paper that wrinkles and tears easily as it's turned, assembly line, tailorized, management monitored scanning procedures for at least 1,000 pages per hour. Not to mention, multiple columns, inset, illustrations, all of the gibberish of pronunciation conventions, syllabic divisions, weird punctuation, etymological symbols, mix of languages and different scripts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all of which means there are almost no dictionaries on Google Books. Obviously didn't stop me from writing my book, doing cumbersome research the old-fashioned way, but case in point, and I think a stark inversion of Helicography's reliance entirely on the circumscribed holdings of Google Books. And I want to be clear that, my point's not just that there are limits to the Google Books catalog. Best research libraries have always been relatively small and precarious. William Joyce, who was the associate rare book and special collections librarian at Princeton before becoming the head of special collections at Penn State, recounts how a full quarter of the books in the Yale Library were lost in 1718 when the collegiate school moved from Saybrook, Connecticut to New Haven. And some of the residents of Saybrook seized as many books as they could, books being that imaginary, symbolic center of the collegiate mass, in a bid to drag the school back to their town under the gravitational pull of its purloined library. Residents of Newark, you'll be glad to know, did not follow suit when the College of New Jersey relocated to Princeton in 1756. But the entire holdings at the time were small enough to be shipped in only 2 boxes. We should remember that libraries define not by the books they have, however few, but by the ones that they exclude, however many. And decades ago, when I taught at Princeton, I was looking for fairly canonical books of Brazilian literature. I kept wandering up and down the stairs in Firestone. I was double checking the floor plans. I was going back up to the stacks. I was thinking, I wasn't understanding something because I could only find this one case. And I finally asked the librarian where all the books were. And he explained that I was in fact in the right place. There just weren't very many. And it turned out that this all goes back to a president of Princeton. I think it must have been Robert Goheen. President of Princeton had been interred at Macau during World War II, where he developed such an aversion to hearing Portuguese spoken, this kind of post-traumatic lusophobia, that it was decades until Princeton tenured a professor in the area. So no professor, no students, no scholarship, no demand, one tiny shelf of whatever Portuguese books happened to come into Firestone by other means, which seems to me perfectly pataphysical, this epiphenomenon that resulted from a chance singularity and that was then relentlessly pursued. It had all the logical academic consequences, even though they followed from this irrational origin. Okay, even more important than size, though, is structure. It's not how big your stack is, but how you catalog it. I think the saying goes. And without being too schematic or determinist, I think we could reflect for a moment on the relationship between libraries and modes of literary criticism, and think of the organization of books in a place like the shelves of the old Alumni Hall in Kenyon in the early 20th century, and the methodologies of new criticism, or the finding aids of special collections, the methodologies of new historicism, where, in contrast to the small college library, predominated by a relatively small number of canonical authors, you have new historicists working in the massive stacks of major research libraries where the most canonical authors sit by alphabetic chance next to the most obscure, and moreover, where the institutional weight of special collections, sequestered on another floor, maybe unlike those metal stacks and linoleum floors, a space with carpet and wood, special lighting. These are special in every way. These archival spaces that not only store texts, but, as Ann Stoler argues, validates the horizon of knowledge itself. So, as such, as these culturally sanctioned repositories of knowledge, spaces that emphasize the immediate metaphysical presence of artifacts, what Stephen Greenblatt calls the intensely present sense of a distant past at the scholar's present reading table, special collections serves up archival artifacts that seem less mediated than, I don't think they are, but they seem less mediated than the modern editions of familiar literary works on the shelves below, and with which they can thus spark and illuminate. So the library, this is the Folger Shakespeare Library, the library simultaneously enables and legitimizes the kinds of intertextual connections on which new historicism is based. To quote Sonia Layden, the archive and or library constitute, as much as they record, the realities they ostensibly only describe. So the epiphenomenal effects of the digital archive are going to be no more direct or determinist, but no less significant as scholars increase their reliance on virtual digital libraries, where, again, more important than even the scope of the virtual library is its interface, the search engine element for accessing texts on the Google servers, how it structures that data. Interface still presents users with the illusion of retrieving discrete books in digital copy, but the database behind that interface is ordered, or in fact disordered otherwise. And this is part of what I was trying to foreground by linking some particular value 2,176 feet, say, in one of the chapters, across books that would never have been associated in conventional schemes of library organization, even if they happened, however unlikely, to be held in the same library collection in the first place. So my lists emerge from an affordance of Google and simultaneously, I think, illustrate its deeper structures. I'm going to end with let me just point out two of those formal structural effects. The first has to do with the temporality and the irreversibility, the singularity of the search. So the results, for instances, of 2,176 feet from Google Books, different today than when I wrote just a year ago, not just because items are accessioned and deaccessioned, as new titles get slowly scanned, as copyright claims are filed, but because the algorithm of the interface varies constantly. It's promoting, deprecating, completely ignoring, and the results are dynamic. They reflect things like previous searches on my part, the web browser I'm using, the location of the hosting services, any number of unknown variables. So as Lydia Gear writes in a footnote to the Imaginary Museum of Musical Works, quote, "The dependence between work and performance is virtual," is her emphasis, is virtual in the sense that it remains a continuing practical possibility. The second has to do with that decoupling of text from its typographic context, and the fact that Google searches its library of books as if it were one big text, which on the one hand permits the kinds of searches that I made, and the far more sophisticated data mining that the courts have recognized as Google's transformative contribution to their safe haven claims of fair use. On the one hand, precisely, it's that endlessly articulatable rhizomatic indexing across books dissolves the borders between discrete publications, expands the horizon of the text to the scale of the library itself with a sublime one-to-one projection of map and territory that Smithson would have recognized as the moment in which, quote, "we are lost between the abyss within us and the boundless horizons outside us." Or as he says, with respect to the Jedi in particular, when one refuses to release scale from size, one is left with an object or language that appears to be certain. For me, scale operates by uncertainty. To be in the scale of the spiral Jedi is to be out of it. On eye level, the tail leads on into an undifferentiated state of matter. One's downward gaze pitches from side to side, picking out random depositions of salt crystals on the inner and outer edges, while the entire mass echoes the irregular horizons. As the authors of the Mondothèque put it, quote, "Working with the semantic web seemed to resemble Hotelet's universal decimal classification system." Is Paul Hotelet and Henri Lafontaine's early 20th century arrangement of all knowledge into related and interlinked fields. It's kind of proto-Wikipedia that has been it's been called a Google made of paper. Librarians continue. At many moments, we felt ourselves going down the rabbit holes of universal completeness, endless categorization, and nauseas of scale. The dreamed objective of the Mondothèque was to interface scales, perspectives, and media at the intersection of all those different practices. And again, it's that interface that's the key to their activist librarianship. Quote, "The point of Mondothèque is to build the collective courage to persist in demanding access to both the documents and the intellectual and technological instruments that interface and mediate them," which carries an urgency, I think, well beyond the domain of Google Books, because the Google Books treatment of discrete documents as though they're one long continuous text is analogous to Google's unstructured structuring of the internet itself as this vast virtual library. It's compiled by web crawlers, it's curated by search engines, and as Dushan Baruch, as the librarian behind Monoscope, figures it, quote, libraries in this sense are not restricted to digitized versions of physical public or private libraries as we know them from history. Commercial search engines, intelligence agencies, and virtually, and underscore that virtual there, virtually all forms of online text collections can be thought of as libraries. So the lineaments of every aspect of our lives, including our lives as writers and researchers under the regime of the internet, will be symbolically attributed from that very virtual. Okay, that's enough, I think. Thank you.